So, life and our times. Many different things happen to us in our lives. Listen to this famous poem. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. That's quite a well-known poem that people sometimes quote. Maybe people don't always realise it's from the Bible, it's from the Old Testament. It's in Ecclesiastes in chapter 3 that we were looking at last weekend. And it really does try to encompass all of life in there. When you take this sort of opposites thing of like north and south or east and west, when we talk in that kind of way, we normally mean everything in between as well. And so really what this poem is intended to include is everything that happens in life, from the beginnings to the ends, the hellos to the goodbyes, and the hurts to the joys, and everything in between. Every aspect of life is meant to be included in this poem. And when you read a poem like this and think about something like this, you can read it in a couple of different ways. You can see it as a poem of despair, that this is it, or you can read it as a story and a poem of hope. And it's a strange thing that when you look at the realities of all these different things that go on in our lives, that life, we realise, is unpredictable and uncontrollable. These things happen to us and we have very little control over it, or even advanced knowledge of when things are going to happen. There is always that thing that blindsides you at 5 o'clock one rainy afternoon that you don't see coming, isn't there? There's things like that happen in life. It's strange even to think how, after talking in chapter 1 about how life is repetitive, that yet at the same time it's also unpredictable. But that is the reality of the world we live in, isn't it? But this passage does not stop there. Chapter 3 does not stop there. The writer, Ecclesiastes, the teacher, the pundit, whatever you want to call him, he carries on and he talks about the struggles of life. He talks about how there's a burden on us from God, and yet he says some of these things. God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He's planted eternity in the human heart, which is interesting, isn't it? That's what gives us that instinct that there must be more to life than this, that we all have really in our more reflective moments, eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. God is doing something and there's a massive scope to it, and we just see a tiny snippet. He says then, he goes on a bit of a downer again, I concluded there's nothing better to be happy and enjoy ourselves as long as we can. There's nothing more to have than that. And people should eat and drink and enjoy the fruits of their labour, for these are gifts from God. And I know whatever God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it or taken away from it. God's purpose is that people should fear him. What is happening now has happened before, and what happened in the future has happened before, because God makes the same things happen over and over again. One of the things that we can put around the times of our lives to not solve every question we have by any means, but one of the things that helps is to have a frame around it. If you imagine all the times of your life as a picture, and then you to put a frame around it that says God is eternal, what he does endures forever. He is doing something the scope of which is from a beginning in long past before we can even imagine, and beyond into the future, that puts our lives into a tiny little slot. When we think in that kind of way and allow that to frame the picture, it doesn't answer every question, but it helps to know that there is an eternal God who is outside of time and around this whole thing. And not only that, a few verses just beyond, it says, in due season God will judge everyone, both good and bad, for all their deeds. And that can be sobering, but it's also encouraging, because we all have an instinct that says there has to be justice. And a verse like this is saying there is ultimate justice. There will be a final reckoning. And those two things together around the giving a frame, if you like, around the times of our lives to know there's a God who's eternal and there's a final reckoning justice helps us to live in our times, our unpredictable and unstable times of joys and despairs and beginnings and endings and everything else. It helps us to live in the way that he says, to eat, drink, enjoy the fruits of our labour and enjoy them as gifts from God. That's what we need to be doing in our lives, to live and recognise that God is different to us, he's bigger, he's greater, but the times of our lives are gifts and we live them for him. Let's remember that.